My name is Stanley Mukolwe. Been married to Patience for the last 32 years. We have 3 grown children. Our youngest one is in her second year in college. And I've been involved with the Navigator ministry since 1979 when I first came to Christ. I was involved in the ministry at the University of Nairobi as a first-year student with some American missionaries and my own cousin Dennis Tongoi discipling me. So I've been involved throughout that period to date. I was selected to lead the Navigator Kenya work in December of 2005 and took office from January 2006. And I served for 10 years. The term is normally a 5-year term that's renewable upon if the leader is agreeable to renew, and those being led are always agreeable. So then in my situation, my term was renewed, so I led for 10 years. My predecessors had done a very good job of investing in the ministry. During the time that Bruce Van Wyk led the work, Bruce was the last American missionary that led this work, and he handed it over to Muto Mahiaini. During that period of time, some property was purchased on Kindaruma Road, where the present Kenya office is located. And so during the time of Bruce Van Wyk, property was purchased, offices were made available to the administration and some of the staff. During Mutua Mahiaini's time, additional buildings were done on the compound. During Dennis Tongoi's time, Dennis took over from Mutua, and Dennis Tongoi and Nick Wanyoike led together. During their time, they made elaborate plans to make additional structures on the existing offices, but those plans were implemented during the time of Paul Kimani, whom I took over from. So during the when I took over the work, the offices were in place, the office structures. One of the biggest challenges we had was income to the ministry. So although we had office space, we did not have adequate income to employ or retain competent administration staff. The field ministry had 25 staff. We call them field ministry partners. So the field ministry had 25 field ministry partners, the majority of who were struggling with their personal fundraising and fundraising for the ministry. So the biggest challenge I faced was funding the administration work as well as funding the field ministry work. And we had some deficits which were inevitable because my predecessors had made some investments, and so the income was going to pay the investment. And so administration had some financial deficits. So part of my challenge was to plug in that deficit and generate new income for the administration, as well as help our field ministry partners to know how to raise additional support so they could be up to budget. So one of the first steps we did was to raise money. We raised $10,000 through some gracious donors, and that helped us to plug the deficit. Then we made some adjustments on the buildings. We moved our bookshop, for example, from downstairs to occupy the office upstairs and rented out the downstairs space. That began to bring in additional income. So we worked on it from both ends, first by creating space that was rentable, reducing the number of employees, and increasing responsibilities upon those who are already working. The next thing we did to increase income for administration was to create additional office space. There used to be a swimming pool and an area around the swimming pool, which was really a relaxing area. We enclosed that area just by building 2 walls and created additional office space. We got a lot of wisdom from people in the building industry, and our investment was really 300,000 shillings, which is like $3,000. But our monthly revenue was 35,000 shillings. Now that looks like small money. When you're dealing with deficits, every single coin counts. So we came to a point where our income and our expenses were balancing out. My next challenge was to think through, when this ministry grows bigger, we will need additional income. And I wanted to think about 10 years into the future. And with the help of other staff, specifically Wanjao Nduba was very instrumental in helping me process and think through how to make further investments. We were able to identify a spot on the compound where the office existed, and we were able to put up 1,000 square meters of building space, which is currently being used as the head office for the Navigators Kenya, with plenty of room available for rental to bring in additional income. So now the building of that office was a big challenge. The total cost of construction was 37 million shillings, which is about $370,000. At that time, it was a little over 400,000 because the exchange rate was 1 to 80. And we got money from different sources. There are former missionaries who gave some money. We had funds in accounts that were not immediately being used. So for example, we looked into the medical account where people can contribute for their outpatient cover. We did an analysis and found out there was money in that account that, although it was designated for medical users, was not being claimed because the contribution from staff, the monthly contribution and the monthly claims were balancing out. So we were able to borrow an internal borrowing from the medical account and put that money towards the building project. And later, when we received rental income, we paid back to the medical account. So we examined various accounts that had designated funds, and in consultation with the board, we were able to borrow some of that money, use it for the construction, and pay it back. The other thing we did was, during the time of Bruce Van Wyk, the American missionary, 2 properties had been purchased in the golf course area. Golf course is a residential area not far from the Navigator office. And these 2 residences were being rented out to staff and staff associates. We did an analysis of the income from those 2 properties and looked at return on investment. And we found that the return was about 4.5%. And I made a proposal to the board that we should sell those 2 buildings and use that money towards the office building, because according to our analysis, the return on renting office space was at about 12%. And so, the board was very supportive of the idea, and we were able to sell those 2 houses and generate about 1/3 of the money that we needed to put up the new office block. So there are people who gave, there are churches that gave, and then we borrowed some money from friends at very low interest. We did not want to venture into a bank loan because bank loans in Kenya are very expensive. And the building came up over a 14-month period. And within 4 years, maybe about 5 years of finishing the building, we were able to repay all our loans, both the internal and external. And we were able to now make more funds available to the ministry. So it was a journey. There were scary moments in there, not wanting to borrow. There's nothing evil about borrowing, but part of my challenge is I do not want to do God's ministry on credit. It's like presuming on the Lord's provision. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, when we have people who are friendly towards us and are able to loan us money on friendly terms, reasonable interest. I remember that the highest interest we ever paid was 10%, which is about half of what our local banks were charging. So when you go those kind of arrangements, then we were able to venture out and borrow, knowing that we could repay it from the new rental income. One of the privileges I had as a leader was the support of my predecessors. And so I remember when I took office, Bruce Van Wyk, the last American missionary, called me up and says, how can we help you lead this work? And so I sat down with Bruce. He came to Kenya, and I sat down with him and showed him what the work looked like. the deficits that we were experiencing and the plans that my predecessors had, which were very good plans, but it's just going to take some amount of time to be able to accomplish them. So Bruce Van Wyk helped us raise a little over $10,000 to pay off our deficit. When it came to raising money for the building, there's a missionary. His name is Les Johnston, was a missionary here back in the 80s and the 90s. He came to Kenya in 2006 when Kenya was celebrating 50 years of the Navigator ministry in Kenya. And I shared plans of increasing income for the ministry. Les Johnston was serving on a church back in the US. And that church was raising money to build a bigger sanctuary. And the church had agreed that whatever money they raise, they would tithe 10% of it to a ministry that is outside their church, whose goals and objectives they were in agreement with. So the Lord caused my path to cross with the path of Les Johnston. When I shared my dream, he had this on his heart already. He encouraged me to apply for that money, and we got $28,000. Then I remember writing to various churches, mentioning to them the benefits they had received by having Navigator staff work in their churches, and asking them if they would consider giving towards our building. One church responded with 500,000 shillings. I remember writing to Navigator associates, people who had been helped by the Navigators. I remember one large gift of another 500,000 from one individual. I remember other smaller gifts coming in, but cumulatively we were able to raise between soft internal loans, gifts, and the sale of the 2 houses from golf course, we were able to raise about 30 million shillings. So the last 8 million, which at that time was about $100,000, was loaned to us by a personal friend from the US who came to visit me. And in the course of sharing what I was doing, he came and looked at the building. I shared with him the challenge I was facing. And he asked me, how can we help? So, of course, you've got two options. You can either give to the work or you can loan money. And he loaned us $100,000, which we were able to repay back within the first 2 years. So when I say we worked on this, there is the leadership team I worked with, the Kenya leadership team, and I had to share all my plans with the leadership team to make sure everybody was on board with it. But then we had the Kenya board, which was extremely supportive. They have to approve all investments. They have to process all proposals to see if they are financially sound. They gave counsel, they gave me the backup I needed. So I had two very good teams of people working with me. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a challenge of funding administration, but also the challenge of funding the field ministry partners. The way the Navigator ministry functions is that when a staff person, a field staff person comes to work for the Navigators, you are coming to work primarily because God is calling you to work. You are not an employee of the Navigators. So you have no expectation of receiving a salary from the Navigators. Fundraising is an integral part of that calling. And so we needed to work with the field partners in helping them to raise their own support. One of the things I found was that a lot of field partners were operating at below 50% of their budgets, which really means that a lot of ministry could not get done because they did not have the funds to do it. They could not travel, for example, to their ministry centers as frequently as they wanted because they did not have the funds to travel. They could not host those they were ministering to because they couldn't afford to host. And some had the attitude that this is the hardship that every minister must face. So they received their challenges graciously and were not really making strong efforts to raise money. Some of them had tried but had failed. They were struggling with their fundraising. One of the things that we did was to invite Scott Morton, the international vice president in charge of funding, and to also to work with the Africa funding coach. At that time, it was Noel Awar. Those two men really backed me up. I called him and asked him, what can we do to help our staff in fundraising? We found out that our staff had not received regular training on fundraising. So right from the year that I took over, 2006, we began to have training seminars for our staff on how to fundraise. Part of the challenge they had was just developing conviction that fundraising was a biblical thing. Part of it was lacking skill. Part of it was just overcoming their own challenges. Some of them did not really believe it was possible to be fully funded. And so when you're working with a staff who doesn't believe he can be fully funded, the effort to be fully funded will be minimal. And so we began to have annual seminars. We set aside 2 weeks a year in which we trained our staff on fundraising, accompanied them on fundraising assignments or fundraising appointments, and just helped them. Worked alongside them. Some staff had come to believe that the fundraising strategies used by the Navigators could only work in the West. What they didn't realize is that when missionaries who were fully funded went out of the mission field, there were probably as many Americans who could not get fully funded that never made it to the mission field. So fundraising is not just a challenge in Kenya, it's a challenge all over the world. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, God is keen to fund his ministry. So to get our staff to believe that God would fund their ministry was an initial obstacle that had to be overcome. And that happened through exposure to the word, through hearing testimonies, through encouragement from Scott Morton and Noel, and my own encouragement. I was fortunate because I was up to budget. And so I could encourage staff to be up to budget because I was up to budget. A part of my own success in my personal fundraising is because there are people who took keen interest in my fundraising and worked alongside me. And so I began to work alongside staff to try and help them in the way that I had been helped. Over the 10 years that I led the work, we saw staff numbers double from 25 to 56. But we saw the fundraising income grow by 600%. The total money raised by the 25 staff in Kenya when I took over was 600,000 shillings a month. By the time I was leaving, 56 staff were raising 3.6 million shillings a year. Now, a good number was still below budget, but it had been demonstrated that funding from Kenya was possible. I think one of the big components to this was the fact that as the number of staff was growing, we were receiving new, younger staff who did not have the funding baggage that the older staff had. See, some of the older staff had come to believe that they could not be fully funded. And so for them to cross that barrier was a challenge. But the younger staff coming in, who are being taught how to fundraise, who did not have the baggage that the older staff had, they went out there, practiced what they were taught, and began to receive results. So part of the challenge is right in the mind. Yeah, if you don't believe you can be funded, you will not be funded. If you believe you can be funded, even if you fail 3 or 4 times, you'll keep on trying until you succeed. The product of our ministry is people. We are not a manufacturing company that produces shoes. We raise people. So relationships in the ministry are key to having a successful ministry. Conflict resolution, just working through interpersonal relationships, that's a challenge of every country leader. And so we worked through that in trying to reconcile old disagreements, working through new emerging disagreements. Wherever you have people, you will have relational challenges. So working through those was always very, very helpful. And I think that part of what I would consider success in that is having the backup of older staff and younger staff. You see, the country leader oversees the entire work. The funding of the work, that's enough headache. That's enough work for the country leader. If that's all he did, he'd be busy. But to do that and to also offer the spiritual leadership of the work, and that's not to say that fundraising is not spiritual, but what I mean by that is that to be able to fund the work, but also remain focused on the calling and on the vision, and to be able to lead a team that is leading people in the field, it's a tall order. So part of the success of that period of leadership is having very competent people on the leadership team who took over their leadership responsibilities very, very responsibly. I remember Chris Amulo, who took over from me. I remember asking him to lead the national students' work. Up to that point, there was no national students leader. Chris Amulo was the first national student leader, and he took that position and that responsibility and ran with it. And I never had to look over my shoulder, because I knew that this work was in the hands of a competent leader. I remember Geoffrey Washiari taking over the Church Discipleship Ministry and running with it. And I could name other leaders who are leading other aspects of the work. But having a team of competent leaders was critical. And I remember in our leadership team meetings, part of my responsibility was then reduced to caring for my team, who would in turn care for the people in the field, and then focusing on the fundraising. To be honest with you, I enjoyed my job. I had a lot of support from staff, a lot of support from the board, a lot of support from those who are funding the work. I think the normal anxieties of leadership, I mentioned the success of putting up that building. I think thoughts come to mind, will I finish this work? What if the building stalls? So, yeah, but I enjoyed my work. I really did. The building was put up in 14 months, and at no one time did it stall because of lack of funding. I thoroughly enjoyed my work, but when the time came to step down, I was very glad to step down, to let others run with it as I focus on my area of calling. When we were thinking about putting up the new office block, initially, we wanted to put it up as a guest house. I'd done my projections on the running of a guest house, and the returns were quite good. And we began to put it up with that in mind. But as I got additional input from businessmen, their advice to me was that although you'll realize the income that you're projecting, the amount of work it takes to run a guest house is so much that it might distract you from your calling and vision. And so at that point, I decided, along with the team, that would switch from building a guest house into building offices. As a ministry, we wanted to invest in income-generating opportunities that would not tie us down in their management. Running a guest house would have taken a lot of time from us. I would say that enterprise, I would say that businesses are a good way to fund the ministry. But I would say that the people who are good at business should do business. The people who are good at ministry should minister. I have seen over and over again a staff person who is struggling to raise money try to do a small business on the side to try and bring in additional income. I've never seen that work. I've seen it attempted many, many times. I've seen people putting 10, 15 hours a week into a small business. It doesn't work. For business to succeed, it needs full-time attention. For ministry to succeed, it needs full-time attention. But the mix can be done in a way that those who are good at business must do business. The ministry can invest in income-generating opportunities, but the ministry staff must not be bogged down in generating that income. Otherwise, they'll compromise their calling. The national leadership team would often be made up of seasoned missionaries. And by missionaries, I don't mean external to Kenya, but local missionaries. So these are people who have understood their calling, people who have ministered for a period of time, people who have received responsibility as a result of a track record of their work. I would advise them to remain focused on the vision. God is able to fund his work, but we must do our part in getting it funded. Don't get sidetracked. Don't look and envy somebody else. You know, it's easy to look at those whom we left college with and envy them because of their financial success. If you were to talk to those people, they're envying you because of your choices and your spiritual success. I would say remain focused. God is no man's debtor. On the young staff who are coming in, I would say make sure God is calling you. Don't try to get in the ministry because you think it sounds good. Make sure the Lord is calling you. When you are sure of that, then move forward and don't look back. God will meet your needs.